Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. As far as college sports are concerned, the next few months are where the sausage gets made. Division One's working group will have to get into the nitty-gritty of putting values into action while remaining under tremendous pressure from state and federal lawmakers who are wondering if the organization can fix itself. For several years, the Knight Commission has worked to create a sustainable and educationally focused model for Division I members to consider and even adopt. Privately, many Division I athletics directors, commissioners, and presidents agree that a change in emphasis and direction is crucial to regaining the public trust. But publicly, they appear to say something else. To help us understand the nuances of this financial proposal and why it could work to the benefit of Division I institutions and student athletes, I'm joined on the podcast by CEO of the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics, Amy Perko, and commission member and former Chief Financial Officer of Major League Baseball, Jonathan Mariner. Jonathan and Amy, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here, Karen.
Good to see you, Karen. Thanks for inviting us.
Jonathan, there was so much to take in at the Knight Commission meeting last week that was held at the NCAA convention. And Jonathan, one of the things you stated was that Division I is facing serious financial challenges. We've known that for some time, but you presented a framework of a potential solution for the broken financial model, which I personally had not heard much about. So could you walk us through the parallels you see between what professional sports faced in 2011 and how they were resolved?
Sure. One of the things I didn't mention, but I thought maybe to add some additional context, I shared here, as I compare my experience in professional sports with what I've seen in the collegiate level, there are a lot of parallels in a very favorable way that the collegiate level is kind of mirrored. For example, all of the different revenue sources that have come into college sports, the TV rights deals, naming rights deals, all of those things have flowed into college sports in a really positive way. On the flip side, you've also seen, coaches' salaries accelerating. And one of the things that the leagues have tried to address was trying to control some of the spending that takes place in their conference, in their leagues. And I mentioned 2011 in particular. It was a very unique time in professional sports. It was the only time that all four professional sports had their collective bargaining agreements expiring in the same year. Turns out that the NHL players had the right to roll over the agreement another year, and they chose to do that. But at the very end of the day, the NHL, the NBA, and the NFL all shut down their sports. And the reason they did it, and people didn't really connect the dots, but the reason they did it was to really reform their business model. Our observations have been that the business model in collegiate sports is broken. And as a parallel, the professional sports leagues all shut down their sports to address it. They thought it was a serious enough issue that they had to take serious steps to do that. And in baseball, I mentioned also, not that year, but earlier in 1994 and again in 2002, addressed their business model. And the key was having a model that allowed teams to at least break even and not just the big market teams.
So give us an example of how, just so we can grasp on this, how was it resolved? What was one way that both sides felt comfortable with this?
There are probably two broad frameworks that the different leagues have looked at. There are caps and there are luxury taxes, and there's hard caps and soft caps. And in fact, in a lot of our recommendations in our care model, we talk about ways that the collegiate that colleges can address the spending that takes place. All this revenue flowing in creates this pressure on spending, and the trick is to fix the business model. How do you control that spending? Some of the leagues have put in place caps, hard caps, and you hear them talking about we have to let this player go. We can't sign this player because of that. That system is one of the tools that's been used. The other system that baseball used, that I'm very familiar with, is a luxury tax, and it's really designed to essentially drive behavior. You don't want to, and I know there are a lot of legal and antitrust issues about trying to control spending at the collegiate level, especially when it comes to salaries, but there are different ways that between penalties and rewards, you can actually control spending. And those are some of the things that we talk about in our care model.
Okay, those two examples are really good. In a moment, we're going to talk a little bit more about the luxury tax. But Amy, let me go to you. You've been working on this, and the Knight Commission is working on a robust financial plan that calls for a values-driven approach to distributing money to Division I programs. The Knight Commission has also advocated for a change in the distribution model, specifically involving revenues and expenses of FBS football. Walk us through what the current issues are, what trustees and presidents need to know, and how your proposals would work.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. First, to be clear, over the past 2 years, we've released several different solutions as we titled really our series of work, Transforming the D1 Model. And we released that after several years of study. This is well before any announcement that the NCAA was going to rework its constitution. So we saw these pressures coming. And the pressures that are upon leaders. But our most recent proposal that Jonathan introduced was released last September, and it's titled Connecting Athletic Revenues to the Educational Model of College Sports. We've dubbed it the Financial Care Model with that fitting acronym. But in short, the proposal would impact $3.5 billion in annual shared revenues that flow into Division I conferences and institutions, by changing the distribution criteria for those funds, as well as impacting the use of the revenues through the different types of ways that Jonathan described. And the goal is clear. It's so that those revenues in the distribution criteria and in the way they're spent would be better directed toward athletes' education, health, and well-being. And those are the principles that the NCAA Constitution, prioritized. The Constitution was voted on just last week, and those are the principles: education, health, and well-being. So our model really offers ways to put those principles into practice. And again, to make clear that these are shared athletic revenue distributions. This does not impact the revenues that each school may generate through their own activities, donations, ticket sales. But the shared athletic revenue distributions are through the NCAA, through its March Madness revenues, which for Division I is about over $600 million annually. The CFP, which I'll emphasize here, is a separate entity from the NCAA. It's one of the most misunderstood facts among higher education leaders and sports fans. And so the CFP generates more than $500 million annually, distributes that money. And then the Division I conferences themselves through their own TV networks and championships. For Division I, the bulk of that is generated by Power 5 conferences, but that's over 2.7 billion. And so this is a big number that can make a huge impact on the financial framework for college sports. And if I can, Karen, I'd like to just point out one other proposal that we have that goes beyond the care model for FBS football and the college football playoff, because some of our I think, again, there's just a really basic misunderstanding on the part of so many about what the CFP is, who runs the CFP, what the NCAA can control and what it can't control. And FBS football, the money's being generated there, really is impacting the entire landscape of college sports. And we've made some simple proposals to the college football playoff. Again, that's a corporate entity separate from the NCAA. The NCAA doesn't generate any money whatsoever from FBS football. And we've made a couple of really simple reform recommendations. One, that athletes should be included in CFP governance. Athletes are included in the NCAA governance. They are not included in CFP governance. Number two, the CFP college football playoff revenues, which again are more than $500 million a year, should cover the national cost for the sport of FBS football. FBS football national cost, like insurance, litigation, legal expenses, those are covered by NCAA March Madness funding. So there's a real dysfunction there that impacts a lot of things. And then number three, there must be financial transparency for CFP revenues. The NCAA publishes an annual financial statement that shows where the March Madness money goes. The same should be true with the CFP and what happens with the CFP revenues. So that's it. That's a summary of both our CARE proposal as well as CFP reform, and that would impact the most significant revenues of shared revenues that are flowing into Division I.
So in a moment, I want to ask you about what the current landscape pre-constitutional convention has looked like so people can compare and contrast. But Jonathan, I want to slide in the idea of a luxury tax in here. Tell us about that. What makes it a good model and who might be currently implementing it that looks like a good model to follow?
Sure. I have some experience with the luxury tax. It's something that Major League Baseball put in place. I mentioned earlier there are caps and there's luxury taxes. The difference is that with a cap, you've got really hard limits on what you can spend for a targeted area. It's really designed to control behavior. There's some soft caps, which means you can spend over a target, but you can't. But there's a penalty. With a luxury tax, there is no prohibition about how much you can spend. You have the luxury of spending more than what's been designated as the limit that you want to see, but you will pay a penalty or a certain premium over that amount. Major League Baseball has that, and it was designed to create a drag on spending for player compensation, and it actually worked at the Major League Baseball level. The growth in revenue fueled by a lot of the unequal revenue coming in from media revenue, it drove player compensation in the double-digit teens before the luxury tax. It ended up being in the single digits in a more balanced way, and so that's how luxury taxes tend to work. And in one of our proposals, we talk about if the goal is to try to in some way slow down or control spending, you can designate levels of spending beyond which it may create either a penalty or a disincentive to receive revenue distributions from some of the national revenue that Amy just talked about. So it's the same theory, the same concept in trying to control spending.
So I'm dating myself a little bit here, but I do remember the days of George Steinbrenner and the New York Yankees. And I used to think to myself, how in the heck could the Kansas City Royals compete against the New York Yankees? And part of it was the luxury tax. Am I right on that, or how does that work?
You are, and one of the other things you mentioned, Kansas City versus New York. If you look at the NFL, the cap allows the New York Giants to allows the Green Bay Packers, a small market, to compete with the New York Giants because they have some control over spending. The luxury tax has that same effect. The other part of the equation, this gets back to what Amy was mentioning before in terms of some of the parallels. Major League Baseball also has a revenue sharing plan where dollars are, from the larger clubs are kind of transferred to the smaller clubs under a formula. And one of the goals is to make sure that the money that's transferred goes towards player compensation. In a very similar way, we're saying as those increased revenues come into college athletics, it should be targeted towards spending that supports these different targets, player, athlete, health and safety issues, spending across other athletic programs, as opposed to going to some of the compensation areas that tend to be escalating. So it's a very similar approach that has been effective in professional sports, could also, we think, help control spending at the collegiate level.
It's interesting. We've had so many media folks, commentators talk about, well, aren't we professionalizing college athletics? But in some ways, you're taking the best of college professional sports and saying this might be able to help us create a more level playing field.
Yes. Yeah, it's really important. And when I talked about the 2011 anomaly of all of them shutting down the sport, they realized that there needs to be some type of control. Otherwise, you would have some really out of control spending, and the spending of one team can drive the cost that affects all of the teams, and that's what we're seeing in college sports right now. So there are indeed a lot of parallels that we think can really help make a difference in collegiate spending.
So let's build on that a little bit and look backwards for a second. Amy, if I'm a new president and I've not really dealt with athletics before, but I'm trying to understand why this change is so necessary, give us a look back 3 to 5 years. Where are we with the dominant of the top tier of Division I sports, and what's happening to the rest of Division I sports?
Yeah, no, great question. And I think to start out, you have to ask which institution, first, is this president going to be in Division I? And if so, which division? Because there really are four separate classifications that have different financial models. The first is the schools in the Power Five conferences, or secondly, that sponsor FBS football. The other group of schools that have FBS football are classified as the Group of Five, and they're outside the Power Five conferences. And let's just take those two as an example. So those offer FBS football. They all benefit in some ways from the college football playoff revenues. Clearly, the Power Five much more so. But if you look at the median in net generated revenues from athletics, just of FBS football schools, of the Power Five, it's a median net negative of about $8 million. So there's institutional support or student fees, even for those schools in the Power Five, and this is according to NCAA data. Of the Group of Five last year, and some of that was impacted by the pandemic, but not in such a significant way. It was 23 million for the Group of Five.
Oh.
Okay, moving to the non-FBS schools, those with FCS football about 14 million, and Division I no football about 13 million. So it's about the same. So
Right.
The question is, from a presidential viewpoint, athletics and the Knight Commission's position is that athletics does provide a wonderful leadership opportunity for young men and women. But the question is, what should that investment be? Clearly, the Power Five are generating, huge sums, but we've seen that it's still not totally self-sustainable. But let's look at the revenues. We have data that show, as those revenues have grown tremendously for those Power Five schools, coaches' salaries have grown at a rate 3 times faster than athletic student aid. So the revenues are not resulting in more opportunities or even more money toward education, health, and well-being of college athletes. Our data show that. And just some recent examples over the past several months show that this inequity is actually getting worse, even as we approach, an expanded CFP playoff that'll generate more revenue. Just real quickly, 8 FBS schools paid more than $90 million to buy out their head coaches' contracts. Eight schools, and and a similar number of Power Five schools recently. Actually, just 3 schools generated or escalated coaching salaries to new highs, signing coaches' contracts worth $9 million annually. So again, the schools are not slowing down on seeking competitive advantages and creating these obligations that are going to further skew where we currently are. And that's why we believe it's absolutely critical for leaders to put the brakes on and do what exactly Jonathan described. We have to fix this financial model before we've created so many obligations, and by these obligations have begun to transform the model without any clear direction, legal analysis. And our model has been legally vetted. And we believe that, we've done a lot of work to try to help leaders, but just really concerned that there's a leadership vacuum right now.
And we'll put a link to all of that work in the liner notes for this particular podcast as well. Jonathan, there's a question that's always run in my mind, but it's because I just don't know. But how much do coaches get paid in the NFL and the MLB? I mean, is it comparison to what college football coaches are getting?
What I find interesting is that I almost reverse it. College coaches are getting paid as much as professional coaches at this point. You're talking about, anywhere from $5 to $10 million for coaches' salaries.
Okay.
Uh,
Okay. So
I'm surprised that college coaches get paid that much, given the disparity in revenue that the sport generates on a comparative basis.
right, right. And that is subjected to all kinds of differences, including conference realignment, which is certainly upended the Power Five as well. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about college athletes having access to negotiating a collective bargaining agreement. What do you see as the pros and cons of that idea? And could that potentially be a reality for the Power Five or some other programs?
I think there's a lot of legal analysis behind that. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't comment at that level. I do recall just from various headlines, there was talk several years ago about players withholding their services, basically saying they're not going to play unless something changed. And when you think about the work stoppages, kind of using that phrase broad in professional sports, it usually comes about from one of two actions: either the players walking out or striking, which is what happened in baseball in 1994, or there's a lockout, which happens to be what's happening right now in baseball. But the other three leagues did the exact same thing in 2011. But that usually is around a conversation, if you will, a collectively bargained conversation around work conditions. There's certain topics that, if there's a legally represented group, a union, there's certain topics you have to bargain over, and we're not suggesting this. I'm not suggesting that there be any kind of a shutdown in college sports. On the other hand, I would make the observation that if college sports doesn't proactively address its model, there could be some legislative solutions that could be far worse than what you can negotiate in a more collaborative way. And whether there's going to be representation at the table, if you will, by players, is not something that they would have a legal right to do. But in some of our other proposals by the Knight Commission, we've always advocated that there be some player representation in any of the different bodies that are governing college sports. And so we think their voice is going to be very important no matter what happens.
Amy, what do you think?
Yeah, I would just add to that we have heard from legal experts that Division I, as it's currently going, must contemplate two future scenarios. One, be prepared for a new model that includes collective bargaining and athlete employees who are also students. And then secondly, a second alternative would be seeking congressional legislative protection for the current educational model. We believe, the commission believes, that the help Division I is looking for from lawmakers will not happen without a commitment to change the financial framework. And it's this chicken or the egg argument, which comes first. But we believe leaders can't have that future in their own hands, that they can commit, because they know they have to change the financial framework. So we have a solution where they can show they're committed to changing this financial framework through the shared distributions, and that's something they can control. We believe should be the centerpiece for this work that is happening now by Division I Transformation Committee. We believe changing the financial framework must be the centerpiece.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you a little about work stoppages, but also, there's always been rumors for years now about the possibility of a boycott of the Final Four, which is the most high-profile event. And certainly, if that happened this year, that would happen in the middle of this constitutional process of trying to flush out. Any response to how much that might upend the process if the athletes would decide to walk this particular Final Four? Either one of you.
Well, yeah. I think I want to jump in. I mean, let's take a step back. The last Final Four, a year ago, there was no athletes were still not allowed to have NIL compensation. Right. We've seen a huge sea change on NIL compensation, and so I think this has been will go down as last year and this year, two of the most pivotal years in college sports, and the year things changed to be, more of a student athlete friendly model, if you will. So, I think there's still obviously a huge question around, well, that the NIL compensation is from third parties, and that's based on what the athletes can generate. Now let's ask the question about, what about the 3.5 billion annually in shared athletic revenues? And so again, that's why you look at the different examples we've offered. We have an example that models out 50% of the shared athletic revenues that a school receives must go toward athlete education, health, safety, or well-being. And kind of that percentage of shared revenues can be analogous to the pro sports model, where you look at, what percentage of revenues go toward athlete salaries, as an example. So in our model, we looked at and we modeled out, and leaders can go to our website to see how their institution compares against that type of an example, a metric. And I think it's really telling in terms of what some institutions would have to do to shift how $5 million, $3 million is spent. I would say in that particular example, the majority of Division I meets it, but the great majority of the Power Five do not.
Jonathan,
I would just add to what Amy has mentioned. Usually in when you have an issue where there may be some services withheld, a walkout or whatever, typically it's in exchange for some other demand. And Amy has touched on something that I think may help, mitigate or maybe avoid that happening. The fact that players now have the right to earn additional compensation from the NIL may help reduce some of the pressures there. But typically when you have that kind of a standoff, the group that's walking out is saying, I want X in return. And it's not clear what the X would be at this point for that to happen, especially in a Final Four setting. The other observation that feeds into that, there is, while there's a union for the Major League Baseball players, baseball, like hockey, has a minor leagues, and the minor league players do not have a union. They're not represented collectively. And the reason is because their tenure within that bargaining unit is not very long. You're only a minor league for a fixed period of time, whereas your major league career starts and kind of continues until you retire. And I see some similarities at the collegiate level, for an athlete, especially who may be a junior or a senior who's going to withhold their services. If you're not in a bargaining unit for a long time to get the benefit of what you might be holding out for it, there's not as much incentive to actually take that action from the way I see it. And it's tough to have a bargaining unit. Not that there couldn't be one, but the alignment of interest over the tenure of the sport gets to be a little trickier when you talk about, someone only being in the unit for 2 to 3 years versus in a professional setting, it's much longer. So just some observations that hopefully might not lead to that kind of an outcome.
Do you think the transfer portal further exacerbates that problem as well?
I think it actually helps from my perspective. And I don't have the depth of knowledge and experience at the collegiate level, but from an outsider's perspective, I always reacted to the limitations on movement of a player at the collegiate level. Not only having to sit out a year, but having to, at one point, get your coach's permission to transfer. That kind of harkens back to the reserve clause in baseball, where player movement was a big deal. What has really fueled professional sports has been free agency, and so essentially college players have free agency now, and I think that's a plus that also reduces perhaps the tensions there.
I want to add one comment to that. Again, the transfer rules being changed to be, again, more athlete friendly or more fair to athletes, to allow that flexibility without having to sit out for a year, kind of serve a penalty for transferring, if you will, for Division I basketball and football. So, but I think what has complicated the current environment in transfer is the mixing of transfer with NIL compensation. But let's take it at its basic level. If that is being done, if promise of NIL compensation is being done with transfer, recruiting inducements, if you will, that, at least by what is written, would violate NCAA, would violate the NCAA rule, which is very minimal. It would also violate a number of state laws that say those things can't be used for recruiting inducements. The issue is, there is no enforcement in place with regard to that, and everyone knows it. And you look at pro sports have a stricter stricter enforcement right now in place for recruiting inducements for free agency, if you will, transfers, athletes transferring teams, than college sports. And that doesn't make much sense. You know, the college sports can't, whatever model, you know, we have in the future, there have to be some guardrails and some rules around that, so that it at least is as strict as professional sports.
Yeah, it definitely feels like the wild, wild west right now. There's no doubt about it. I want to shift gears one other direction. Amy, the Knight Commission produces such credible research, reports, and op-eds so that the public and scholars and higher ed leaders can consider alternative perspectives to the financial pressures and ethical challenges facing college sports. Has the Knight Commission ever worked with other national higher ed associations like the American Council on Education, the Association for Governing Boards, AACSU, and others to create partnerships and joint statements? If so, what do they have to say?
Sure, great question. We have, over the years, worked with higher education groups, particularly around, you know, just being available as a resource. We met with the higher ed secretariat last year that includes the leaders of all of those associations to let them know about our work, the reports we had released at that point. And in fact, I'm headed to a program, AGB Foundations, just occurring on Monday to do a session on with Carol Cartwright on the trends in athletics. And I know our co-chair, Nancy Zimfer, just did a program with AGB. So, you know, we look for more opportunities to do that, because clearly things are changing quickly. I would say in terms of working with those groups to provide kind of joint statements, we haven't done that recently. And I think one of the reasons is that those groups, things again are changing so rapidly in college sports. I think those groups are looking for, you know, to really work out their own positions and looking to the NCAA for leadership on, you know, what position they should be taking. And right now, the NCAA as a staff is looking for the conferences to lead, and the conferences are competing with each other, and it's not a very clear picture right now in terms of you know, the future. So, you know, I would say we would be hopeful that all of those higher ed associations would endorse our most recent, you know, care model approach. I think it's certainly, again, a way, all of the principles are certainly in alignment with what those associations have said about college sports. And again, it's a way to put principles into practice.
Finally, for both of you, why is this such a crucial moment for folks to learn more about the challenges facing both higher education and college athletics? Either one of
I'll
you
start and let Amy
Okay.
bat cleanup on this one. I think in real simple terms, I think that for many people like myself who are huge fans of college sports, it's going through a real fundamental change. And for as much as anyone fan might think, I would love for my school to win national championship every year throughout, the lessons from professional sports is that dynasties aren't good for the overall sport. You want to have some kind of balance. You want to make sure that everyone has a chance to win, to compete. That creates interest across the entire industry. And I think given some of the challenges that the schools face economically, I think for it to be sustainable and for the you know, the true college model where, you know, the best interest of the athlete, the educational focus, the academic focus, for that to remain part of college sports, you really have to pay attention to and support some of the things we're talking about. Otherwise, it could become a professionalized industry, which is not what I think most people really would want or would really appreciate.
Well said.
Yeah, I can't add much more to that because that is the issue at its fundamental point. And I think there are over 1,000 Division I, II, and III universities competing in college sports. the vast majority of those, really the vast majority see athletics as an opportunity to help enrollment, driving enrollment, and providing these leadership and just developmental opportunities for young men and women. And you don't want to see the model at the top, the very elite Power 5, very commercial, big revenue, impact the way athletics functions at all of the other levels, because there's a massive difference. And yet, some of what's happening at the very top, could turn some of the legal rulings could be, those athletes are employees. Well, what does that mean for everyone else? Even with NIL, we're seeing developments that now institutions are triggering Title IX with the way they're operating NIL. That has huge impacts, and will have huge impacts if other institutions start trying to do what they see happening in the Power 5. And so there are a lot of implications with some of the changes that are just quickly evolving because of the competitive drive. And so it's a really critical time for leaders to really assess, what they want this model to be, and to really understand all the consequences of those developments.
Well, Jonathan and Amy, thank you so much. You've given both myself and my audience a lot to think about at a very critical moment in the evolution of college sports. And I'm really hopeful that folks will take the hard work and dedication that so many people put into creating the care model, and to realize that we need to get back to our roots and our values. So thank you both so much for joining me on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Karen.
Thanks,
Enjoyed being
Karen.
here.